The unexpected turbulence. The airport buzzed with its usual symphony of sounds, rolling luggage wheels, announcements echoing overhead, and the hum of conversations blending into a steady backdrop. Naomi Walker stood amidst the bustle, holding the hand of her 5-year-old daughter, Ava, who clutched a small, worn-out stuffed elephant named Ellie. Ava's face was a mix of excitement and awe as she marveled at the towering planes outside the massive glass windows. "Mommy, are we really going to see dolphins?" Ava asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Naomi knelt to meet her daughter's gaze, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart. Dolphins, turtles, and maybe even a rainbow fish as big as you," she said with a warm smile. Behind them, Richard Walker, Naomi's husband, was focused on his phone, double-checking their flight details for the umpteenth time. He was the planner of the family, meticulous to a fault, and today was no exception. This trip, a long-awaited vacation to a tropical paradise, was his way of ensuring their family reconnected after months of grueling work schedules. "Gate 14, Richard announced, glancing up from his phone and motioning them forward. They'd made their way toward the boarding area, where the premium-class passengers were being called first. The Walkers had splurged on an upgrade, a luxury they seldom allowed themselves, but this trip was special. Naomi had imagined Ava's joy when she saw the ocean for the first time, her delight at meeting dolphins up close. Every penny spent seemed worth it. As they approached the gate, Naomi noticed a flight attendant standing near the entrance to the jet bridge. Her name tag read Karen M., and her demeanor was as crisp as her pressed uniform. Karen stood with an air of authority, her sharp eyes scanning the passengers, as if she were a hawk surveying its territory. Naomi offered a polite smile as they handed over their boarding passes. "Good morning," she said warmly. Karen barely glanced at them before replying curtly, "Please move along." Naomi blinked, taken aback by the coldness in Karen's tone, but she didn't dwell on it. People had bad days, she reasoned. They boarded the plane and found their seats in the premium cabin. Ava scrambled onto the seat by the window, her excitement bubbling over as she pressed her face against the glass. "Mommy, look. The plane is so big. It's like a spaceship," Ava exclaimed. Naomi laughed softly, leaning over to share in her daughter's amazement. Meanwhile, Richard was busy organizing their carry-on bags and ensuring everything was in place. As the cabin filled with passengers, Naomi felt a moment of peace. They were finally here, on the brink of an unforgettable adventure. The hum of anticipation filled the air as the final passengers settled in, and the plane prepared for takeoff. Then Naomi noticed something unsettling. Karen, the flight attendant from the gate, had entered the premium cabin. Her eyes swept the rows of passengers, her gaze sharp and assessing. When her eyes landed on Naomi's family, they lingered, her expression unreadable but not friendly. Naomi shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at Richard, who was oblivious to Karen's scrutiny. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay. Please remain seated as we address a minor issue before takeoff. We apologize for the inconvenience." A murmur of discontent spread through the cabin, passengers shifting in their seats and glancing at their watches. Naomi frowned. Delays were common, but something felt off. Karen reappeared, speaking quietly with another flight attendant near the galley. Their hushed conversation seemed tense, with occasional glances in Naomi's direction. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. Then, without warning, Karen marched down the aisle and stopped in front of their row. Her expression was cold, her posture rigid. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice devoid of warmth. "I need to ask you to step off the plane." Naomi stared at her, stunned. "What? Why?" Karen's tone was clipped. "I need you and your family to disembark immediately." Richard stood, his confusion quickly turning to anger. "What's the problem? We haven't done anything wrong. We paid for these seats. This isn't up for discussion," Karen replies sharply. Please gather your belongings and leave the plane. Ava looked up at her parents, her small voice trembling. Mommy, are we going home? Naomi knelt to comfort her daughter, masking the turmoil raging within her. No, sweetie. Everything's fine. Just stay close to Mommy and Daddy. Passengers around them began to whisper, their eyes darting between the walkers and Karen. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Richard, his jaw clenched, grabbed their bags and turned to Naomi. This is ridiculous, he muttered. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Naomi's heart pounded. She glanced back at the cabin, the confused faces of the passengers staring back at her. Karen's expression was steely, her gaze unyielding. What had just happened? They had followed every rule, done nothing to disrupt the flight, yet they were being treated like criminals. Naomi's mind raced as they walked back into the terminal. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no random act. Something deeper, something insidious, was at play. Little did she know, the truth behind Karen's actions would soon unravel, setting off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The storm brewing beneath the surface was about to break, and its impact would change everything. Ripples of injustice. Naomi Walker sat on a cold metal bench in the terminal, cradling Ava on her lap. The hum of the bustling airport seemed distant now, as though the world around them was submerged in a fog. Richard paced back and forth in front of her, his hands clenched into fists, his face dark with simmering anger. His measured, thoughtful demeanor had been replaced with something Naomi rarely saw in him: helpless rage. Ava clutched her stuffed elephant tightly, her wide eyes darting between her parents. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice tinged with confusion and fear. "Why did the lady make us leave?" Naomi swallowed the lump in her throat, gently running her fingers through Ava's curls. "I don't know, baby," she said softly, trying to mask the crack in her voice. "But we'll figure it out, okay?" Richard stopped pacing, turning to Naomi. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice low but sharp. "We did nothing wrong. We boarded like everyone else. We had paid for those seats. Why us?" Naomi shook her head, unable to offer him any answers. Her mind raced, replaying the events on the plane over and over. She couldn't pinpoint a single moment where they had acted out of line. Yet here they were, humiliated, singled out, and now stranded in the terminal. "Richard," Naomi began hesitantly, her voice trembling. Do you think it's because we're—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Richard's eyes met hers, and she saw the realization settle on his face like a heavy weight. It wasn't a possibility they wanted to consider, but it loomed over them like a dark shadow. Before either of them could speak further, Karen appeared once more, accompanied by 2 uniformed security officers. Naomi's stomach sank as she saw the smug satisfaction on Karen's face, as though she had already won some unspoken battle. "Ma'am, sir," one of the officers began, his tone clipped and professional. "We've been informed that you were asked to leave the aircraft. Is there an issue we need to address?" Richard stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with controlled fury. "Yes, there's an issue. We were kicked off the plane without any explanation. We didn't cause a scene. We didn't do anything wrong. We paid for our seats, and we were just trying to enjoy our flight." Karen crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "Sir, this is for the safety and comfort of all passengers. I don't need to explain my decisions to you." Naomi felt her own anger bubble to the surface. She stood, still holding Ava, and faced Karen directly. "Safety and comfort," she repeated, her voice sharp. "What exactly did we do that made you feel unsafe? What part of sitting quietly in our seats made us a threat?" Karen's gaze faltered for a brief moment before she steeled herself. "Ma'am, I've already explained." "No, you haven't," Naomi interrupted, her voice rising. "You haven't explained anything. You're hiding behind your authority, and you're punishing my family for reasons you can't even justify." The terminal grew quieter as nearby travelers began to take notice of the confrontation. Whispers spread through the crowd, eyes flicking toward the walkers, and the scene unfolding around them. "Ma'am, please lower your voice," one of the security officers said, stepping between Naomi and Karen. "We don't want to escalate the situation." "Escalate?" Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with incredulity. "You think we're the ones escalating this? She's the one who humiliated my family in front of a plane full of people without cause." Karen remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Naomi could see the faintest flicker of discomfort in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of indifference. Before the officers could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "They didn't do anything wrong." Naomi turned, startled, to see a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair stepping forward. She was one of the passengers from their flight, her expression resolute as she approached the group. "I was sitting 2 rows behind them," the woman continued, her voice firm. "They were quiet, respectful, and didn't cause any trouble." "This isn't right." The security officers exchanged uncertain glances. Karen's face flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. "Ma'am, I appreciate your input, but this is an internal matter. Please return to your gate." "I'm not going anywhere," the woman said, her voice growing louder. "You can't treat people like this and expect the rest of us to stay silent." More passengers began to gather, their murmurs growing louder. A young man in his 20s joined the woman, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, I saw what happened too. They didn't do anything to deserve this." Naomi felt a flicker of hope, her heart swelling at the sight of strangers coming to their defense. She looked at Richard, who seemed equally stunned by the sudden turn of events. Karen, however, looked less pleased. "This is a private matter," she said tersely, her voice tight with frustration. "If you don't return to your seats, I'll have no choice but to call airport authorities." "Go ahead," the blonde woman shot back. "Call whoever you want. But we're not letting this slide." The crowd around them grew larger, more voices chiming in to question Karen's actions. Naomi could see the cracks forming in the flight attendant's composed facade, her posture stiffening as she struggled to maintain control. One of the security officers cleared his throat, stepping forward. "Let's all calm down," he said, his tone placating. "We need to resolve this situation peacefully." Naomi seized the moment, turning to the officer. "All we're asking for is an explanation. If we've done something wrong, tell us. If there's a policy we violated, show us. But don't treat us like criminals when we've done nothing to deserve it." The officer hesitated, his gaze flicking to Karen, who refused to meet his eyes. The silence stretched uncomfortably, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, the blonde woman spoke again, her voice cutting through the stillness. "If you don't make this right, I'll make sure everyone hears about it. Social media, news outlets, everything. People need to know what kind of treatment they can expect from your airline." Karen's face paled slightly, and for the first time, Naomi saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. It was clear that the situation was spiraling out of her control, and the growing crowd wasn't helping her case. The security officer sighed, turning to Karen. "Do you have any documentation or evidence to support your decision to remove this family?" Karen opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her hesitation speaking volumes. Naomi felt a surge of vindication, her earlier helplessness giving way to a newfound determination. As the confrontation continued, Naomi couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The injustice they had faced was undeniable, but the unexpected support from strangers gave her hope. Together, they would uncover the truth and hold Karen accountable for her actions. And as the whispers and murmurs grew louder around her, Naomi knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. The rising tide. The terminal was no longer just a passage for travelers. It had become the stage for a brewing storm. Naomi stood amidst the growing crowd, her hand gripping Ava's tightly. The little girl, sensing the tension, remained unusually quiet, her small body pressed against her mother's leg. Richard stood beside them, his face tight with restrained fury, his fists clenched at his sides. Around them, The voices of strangers rose in a cacophony of outrage and support. "This is outrageous," muttered a man with salt and pepper hair, shaking his head as he gestured toward the scene. "You can't just kick people off a flight for no reason." A younger woman, likely in her 20s, had already started recording the confrontation on her phone. "This needs to go viral," she said, her voice low but resolute. "People need to know what's happening here." Karen, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, looked increasingly cornered. Her previously confident demeanor was now fraying at the edges, her eyes darting nervously between the growing crowd and the security officers who flanked her. She opened her mouth as if to speak but seemed to think better of it, her lips pressing into a thin line. Naomi took a deep breath, her voice steady but tinged with emotion as she addressed the crowd. "We're just a family trying to take a vacation," she said, her eyes scanning the faces around her. "We followed every rule, paid for our seats, and did everything right. But we were kicked off the plane without a single explanation. Why?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her frustration and pain. The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a mix of sympathy and indignation. One of the security officers, a middle-aged man with a graying mustache, stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but we need to de-escalate this situation. If there's been a misunderstanding, we'll address it." Naomi's eyes flashed with determination. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. This is about accountability. That woman," she said, pointing toward Karen, "used her authority to humiliate and remove us without cause. We deserve answers." The officer glanced at Karen, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "Ms. Millister," he said, his tone now pointed, "can you clarify the reason for this family's removal?" Karen straightened her posture, her expression hardening. "As I stated earlier, their presence on the flight was causing discomfort to other passengers," she said curtly. "As a flight attendant, it's my responsibility to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone on board." Naomi's jaw dropped. "Discomfort," she echoed, incredulous. "We didn't even speak to anyone. How could we possibly make anyone uncomfortable?" Karen's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "It's not always about direct behavior," she said vaguely. "Sometimes it's about maintaining a harmonious environment." The words hung in the air like a bad joke. The crowd erupted in whispers, their disbelief and anger palpable. "That's not an answer," shouted the blonde woman who had come to Naomi's defense earlier. She crossed her arms, her expression unyielding. "You're just making excuses to cover up your own prejudice." Karen's face flushed, her composure slipping further. "I don't have to justify my actions to you," she snapped. "I was doing my job." Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady, but filled with controlled fury. "Your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers, not just the ones you deem acceptable. We deserve to be treated with respect, just like everyone else." At that moment, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Excuse me, but I think this situation warrants further investigation." The crowd turned as a tall, imposing figure approached. He wore a sleek business suit, his polished demeanor radiating authority. Naomi recognized him as one of the passengers from the premium cabin. He had been seated across the aisle, silently observing the events as they unfolded. "I'm Daniel Graves," he said, extending a hand to the security officers. "I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights cases, and I couldn't, in good conscience, let this matter go unaddressed." Karen's face drained of color. "This isn't necessary," she said quickly, her voice tinged with panic. "The airline has protocols." Daniel held up a hand to silence her. "And I'm well versed in airline protocols, Ms. Millister," he said coolly. "But I'm also well versed in recognizing discriminatory practices when I see them." Naomi felt a surge of gratitude and relief as Daniel turned to her and Richard. "I witnessed the entire situation," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You were removed without cause, and the flight attendant's behavior was not only unprofessional but potentially unlawful. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support bolstering Naomi's resolve. Karen's composure was now unraveling completely, her eyes darting between Daniel and the security officers as she struggled to regain control of the narrative. "This is unnecessary," she said again, her voice trembling slightly. "They were simply asked to leave." "For what reason?" Daniel interjected sharply. "Your vague justifications won't hold up under scrutiny. If this family was removed due to their race or appearance, that constitutes a serious violation of anti-discrimination laws." The security officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. The mustached officer finally spoke, his tone cautious. "Perhaps we should bring in a representative from the airline's management to mediate this situation." "That's an excellent idea," Daniel said, his tone clipped. "In the meantime, I'll be documenting everything and advising the walkers on their legal options." Karen's face twisted in frustration, but she said nothing, her earlier confidence now entirely evaporated. The crowd, emboldened by Daniel's intervention, began to voice their support more openly. "This is why people don't trust airlines anymore," muttered an older man in the crowd. "They think they can get away with anything," added a young woman, her phone still recording. Naomi turned to Daniel, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "We didn't know what to do." Daniel offered her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to face this alone," he said. "What happened to you is unacceptable, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you get justice." As they waited for the airline representative to arrive, Naomi felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The day had taken a turn she never could have anticipated, but the kindness of strangers and the intervention of Daniel Graves gave her the strength to keep fighting. For the first time since the ordeal began, Naomi allowed herself to believe that they might come out of this stronger than before. What Karen had intended as a quiet dismissal had sparked a movement of solidarity and resistance, and the ripples of her actions were just beginning to spread. Gathering strength. The tension in the terminal continued to grow as the crowd thickened. Naomi could see more passengers from their flight approaching, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Some had phones out, recording videos or taking pictures, while others whispered to each other, exchanging snippets of what they'd witnessed. The air buzzed with a collective sense of injustice. Ava tugged at Naomi's sleeve, her small voice breaking through the noise. "Mommy, are we still going to see dolphins?" Naomi crouched down, cupping her daughter's face gently. "We will, sweetheart," she promised, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "We're going to fix this first, okay?" Ava nodded solemnly, her tiny hand clutching Ellie, the stuffed elephant. Naomi stood back up, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about their vacation anymore. This was about standing up for her family, for Ava's future, and for anyone else who might be treated unfairly like this. The airline representative arrives. After what felt like an eternity, a man in a tailored Navy suit arrived, accompanied by 2 more uniformed staff members. He walked with a purposeful stride, his face set in a neutral expression that betrayed none of his thoughts. A gold badge on his chest identified him as William Tennyson, regional manager. "I'm William Tennyson," he announced, his voice calm but authoritative. "I've been briefed on the situation, and I'd like to understand exactly what transpired here." Before Naomi or Richard could speak, Karen jumped in, her voice clipped. "Mr. Tennyson, I acted in the best interest of the flight and its passengers. The family was removed to maintain order and ensure everyone's comfort." Tennyson raised a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "I appreciate your input, Ms. Mellister," he said evenly. "However, I need to hear directly from the walkers." Karen's mouth snapped shut, her lips pressing into a thin line. Naomi felt a rush of gratitude toward the manager's measured approach, though the tension in her chest remained heavy. Naomi took a deep breath, steadying her voice as she spoke. "We boarded the flight like everyone else," she began. "We followed every instruction. took our seats, and didn't cause any disruption. But shortly before takeoff, Ms. Millister approached us and told us we had to leave. When we asked why, she refused to explain. Richard stepped in, his voice firm. We paid for premium seats. We planned this trip for months, and we were treated like we didn't belong there. It was humiliating and completely unjustified. Tennyson's gaze remained fixed on them, his expression thoughtful. Did she provide any specific reason for your removal? He asked. No, Naomi said, her voice tightening. She said it was for the comfort and safety of other passengers, but we didn't even speak to anyone. She couldn't point to a single thing we did wrong. The crowd murmured in agreement, voices rising in support of Naomi's account. She's telling the truth, said the blonde woman who had defended them earlier. I was sitting near them. They were perfectly fine. Polite, quiet, just a normal family excited for their trip. This is discrimination, plain and simple. Daniel Graves, the attorney, stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. Mr. Tennyson, I witnessed the events myself, he said. Ms. Millister's actions appear to be motivated by personal bias rather than any legitimate safety concern. This isn't just poor judgment. It's a violation of anti-discrimination laws. Tennyson's face grew more serious as he absorbed the growing testimony against Karen. He turned to the security officers, who shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. Did either of you observe any behavior from the walkers that warranted their removal? Tennyson asked. The mustached officer cleared his throat. No, sir, he admitted. We were called to escort them off the plane based on Ms. Millister's report. We weren't given any specific details about misconduct. Karen's face reddened, her composure visibly crumbling. I was doing my job, she said defensively. It's my responsibility to assess situations and act accordingly. But your actions have consequences, Daniel countered, his voice sharp. You can't wield authority without accountability. Removing a family without cause isn't just unprofessional, it's unethical. The crowd takes a stand. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a wave of solidarity swelling around the walkers. More passengers began to speak up, recounting what they had seen. I was right behind them when they boarded, said a man in his 50s. They were polite to the gate agent, followed all the rules. There was no reason for them to be treated like this. They didn't do anything wrong, added a younger man with a backpack slung over one shoulder. If anything, the way they were singled out felt deliberate. Tennyson raised a hand to quiet the crowd. Thank you all for your input, he said, his tone firm, but not dismissive. This is a serious matter, and I assure you it will be addressed appropriately. He turned back to Naomi and Richard, his expression softening. On behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for the way you were treated. You should never have been made to feel unwelcome or disrespected. Naomi felt a lump rise in her throat, a mix of relief and lingering frustration. It's not just about an apology, she said quietly. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Tennyson nodded. You're absolutely right. We'll be launching an internal investigation into Ms. Millister's conduct, and appropriate action will be taken based on our findings. An offer of reparation. As the tension began to ease, Tennyson motioned for a nearby staff member, who approached holding a tablet. In the meantime, he said, we'd like to rebook you on the next available flight in premium class at no additional charge. Additionally, we'll be covering all associated expenses and offering a full refund for your original booking. Naomi exchanged a glance with Richard, who gave a small nod. While the offer didn't erase the hurt and humiliation they had experienced, it was a step toward rectifying the situation. And Tennyson added, his gaze shifting toward Karen, we'll ensure that you're treated with the respect you deserve on this and any future flights with our airline. Karen's face was a mask of barely concealed fury, but she said nothing, her earlier bravado now reduced to silence. Naomi exhaled deeply, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. She looked down at Ava, who was still clutching her stuffed elephant, her expression hopeful. Mommy, does this mean we can still see the dolphins? Naomi smiled, her voice soft but certain. Yes, baby. We'll see the dolphins. The spark of change. As the crowd began to disperse and the walkers prepared to board their rescheduled flight, Naomi couldn't help but reflect on what had transpired. The injustice they had faced had been painful, but the support of strangers and the courage of those who spoke out gave her hope. This wasn't just about her family anymore. It was about standing up to prejudice, holding people accountable, and creating a ripple effect of change. Naomi knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she also knew one thing for certain. They were not alone in this fight, and together, they could make a difference. Strength in unity. As Naomi and Richard sat in the new waiting area for their rescheduled flight, the initial adrenaline of the confrontation began to wear off, replaced by a gnawing exhaustion. Ava, now curled up against Naomi's side, had finally fallen asleep. Ellie the elephant still clutched tightly in her tiny hands. Richard leaned forward in his seat, his elbows on his knees, his jaw set in a grim line. The terminal around them was quieter now, the buzz of earlier drama having dissipated, but the emotional weight of what had happened still hung heavy in the air. Naomi reached out, placing a hand on Richard's arm. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Richard let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I keep thinking about Ava," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "What kind of example are we setting for her? That people can treat us like this, and all we get is an apology and a voucher." Naomi squeezed his arm gently. "We didn't just accept it," she said. "We fought back. We stood up for ourselves, and people saw it, Richard. People stood with us. That's what Ava will remember." Richard nodded slowly, but the tightness in his expression didn't ease. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. Naomi couldn't argue with that. The sting of humiliation was still fresh, and the uncertainty of what would happen next made it hard to fully relax. But there was one thing she knew for sure. They couldn't let this experience define them. Unexpected allies. As they sat in silence, Naomi noticed the blonde woman from earlier walking toward them, her stride purposeful. She was holding a steaming cup of coffee in each hand, a kind smile softening her features. "Hi," the woman said as she approached, handing the cups to Naomi and Richard. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up. It's not much, but—" Naomi smiled gratefully, taking the coffee. "Thank you," she said. "You've already done so much. I don't even know your name." The woman extended her hand. "It's Margaret," she said. "Margaret Klein." "Naomi," she replied, shaking Margaret's hand. "And this is Richard. That's Eva." She glanced down at her sleeping daughter with a small smile. Margaret took a seat beside them, her expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," she said. "I've been flying for decades and I've seen things like this too many times. It's wrong, and it needs to stop." Naomi nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for this stranger's empathy. "It's hard not to feel powerless," she admitted. "Even with people speaking up, it's like we're just one family against a giant corporation." Margaret's expression hardened. "You're not powerless," she said firmly. "You have people on your side. And the more voices you have, the harder it is for them to ignore you." Naomi glanced at Richard, who was listening intently. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean there's strength in numbers," Margaret replied. "That attorney, Daniel, seems like he knows what he's doing. But you also have witnesses, people like me who saw what happened. If you're willing, we can help make sure your story doesn't just disappear." A movement takes shape. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened a social media app. "I already posted about what happened," she said, showing them the screen. The post was simple but powerful, detailing the incident and calling out the airline for their discriminatory treatment. It had already garnered hundreds of likes and comments, with people expressing outrage and support for the walkers. "People are paying attention," Margaret said. "If we keep the pressure on, the airline will have to take this seriously." Naomi felt a mix of hope and apprehension. The idea of their story going public was daunting, but the thought of holding the airline accountable was compelling. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "What if it backfires? What if they twist it to make us look bad?" Margaret placed a reassuring hand on Naomi's arm. "That's why you have witnesses," she said. "People like me, and others who were on the flight. We'll stand with you." Richard leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about us," he said finally. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. If we stay quiet, it's like saying it's okay, and it's not." Naomi looked at her husband, seeing the determination in his eyes. She thought about Ava, about the kind of world she wanted her daughter to grow up in. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's do it." The call to action. Margaret's post was just the beginning. Over the next hour, she and Naomi worked together to draft a detailed account of what had happened, complete with video clips and statements from witnesses. They uploaded the story to social media, tagging the airline, and using hashtags like #TravelWhileBlack and #StandUpForJustice. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from people all over the world, sharing their own stories of discrimination and expressing solidarity with the walkers. News outlets began reaching out, requesting interviews and additional details. Daniel Graves, the attorney, called Naomi to offer his support. "I've already started drafting a formal complaint," he said, "and if the airline doesn't respond appropriately, we'll take legal action." Naomi felt a surge of gratitude for the network of support that was forming around her family. It was no longer just their fight, it was a movement. Corporate response. Later that evening, as they waited for their new flight, Naomi's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an official statement from the airline, posted on their social media page. "We are aware of the incident involving the Walker family and are conducting a thorough investigation. Discrimination of any kind is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of our company. We apologize to the Walkers and all passengers affected by this incident. Further action will be taken to ensure accountability and prevent similar situations in the future." Naomi read the statement aloud to Richard and Margaret, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Do you think they mean it?" she asked. Richard shrugged. "It's a start," he said, "but we'll see if they actually follow through." A new journey. As their rescheduled flight began boarding, Naomi felt a mix of emotions. The sting of what had happened was still fresh, but the outpouring of support from strangers gave her hope. She looked at Ava, who was now wide awake and chattering excitedly about dolphins again, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This isn't the end," Naomi said quietly to Richard as they walked down the jet bridge. "We still have a lot to do." Richard nodded, his expression resolute. "But we're not doing it alone," he said. "That makes all the difference." As they settled into their seats, Naomi glanced out the window, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. It wasn't the vacation they had planned, but it was the beginning of something bigger, a journey not just to a tropical paradise, but toward justice and change. And this time, they were ready for the turbulence ahead, the aftermath of a spark. The Walker family's ordeal might have started in the confines of an airplane, but its impact had grown into something much larger. By the time their rescheduled flight landed at their tropical destination, the story had gone viral. Naomi's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, texts, social media mentions, emails from journalists, and messages of support from strangers around the world. The incident had struck a chord, resonating with countless people who had faced similar discrimination or who simply believed in the power of standing up for justice. As they walked through the breezy terminal, the humid, salty air signaling their arrival in paradise, Naomi felt the strange weight of both relief and responsibility. This was supposed to be a getaway, a time to unwind and reconnect as a family. But now it felt like they were part of something far bigger than themselves. Ava, oblivious to the whirlwind around them, skipped happily beside her parents, her stuffed elephant in tow. "Are we going to see dolphins now, Mommy?" she asked, her voice filled with pure, childlike wonder. "Yes, sweetheart," Naomi said, kneeling to adjust Ava's sun hat. "First thing tomorrow." But as much as she wanted to focus on Ava's joy, Naomi couldn't ignore the growing storm that awaited them back home. A voice that refused to be silenced. That evening, after Ava had fallen asleep in their cozy beachfront villa, Naomi and Richard sat on the balcony, the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore providing a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "We should enjoy this time while we can," Richard said, his voice low as he leaned back in his chair. "Once we're back home, this is going to get a lot bigger." Naomi nodded, her fingers absent-mindedly scrolling through the flood of messages on her phone. The airline had reached out directly, offering another apology and proposing a meeting to discuss the situation further. News outlets were clamoring for interviews, and the video footage taken by witnesses on the flight had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. "It already feels bigger than us," Naomi admitted, "but maybe that's a good thing. If we can help shine a light on how wrong this is, maybe it'll force them to change." Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I agree, but we need to be smart about how we handle this. We don't want it to turn into a spectacle." Naomi knew he was right. It was one thing to share their story, but it was another to make sure it led to real, meaningful change. She reached out to Daniel Graves, the civil rights attorney who had supported them in the terminal, and scheduled a video call for the next morning. The strategy for change. The following day, while Ava played in the sand under Richard's watchful eye, Naomi sat on the villa's patio, her laptop open, and Daniel's calm, authoritative voice coming through the screen. "This is more than just an apology issue," Daniel said, his face serious. "It's about systemic problems within the airline industry and how authority is wielded without accountability. If we're going to make an impact, we need to focus on more than just your specific case." Naomi nodded, scribbling notes as Daniel outlined their next steps. "What do you suggest?" "First, we'll file a formal complaint with the airline, backed by the statements of witnesses and the video evidence." "That's step one," Daniel said. "But we also need to push for broader policy changes, mandatory diversity and bias training for staff, transparent procedures for passenger removals, and an independent review board to oversee incidents like this." Naomi's eyes widened. She hadn't thought beyond the immediate injustice her family had faced, but Daniel's vision was much larger. "Do you really think we can push for that?" she asked. "Absolutely," Daniel replied firmly. "Your story has momentum, and the public is paying attention. Corporations don't change out of the goodness of their hearts. They change when they're held accountable. A movement gains traction." Over the next few days, as the walkers enjoyed the sun-drenched beaches and crystal-clear waters, the story continued to grow. Naomi gave a carefully coordinated interview with a major news outlet, where she shared the details of their experience while emphasizing the need for systemic change. Richard appeared in a separate segment, his calm and composed demeanor helping to further legitimize their cause. Social media erupted with hashtags like #JusticeForWalkers and #AirlineAccountability. Celebrities, activists, and public figures began to weigh in, amplifying the conversation. Even passengers who had initially been silent came forward, adding their voices to the growing chorus of outrage. Naomi received countless messages of support from strangers, some sharing their own experiences of discrimination, others simply offering words of encouragement. But amidst the outpouring of solidarity, there were also critics, accusing the walkers of seeking attention or exaggerating the situation for personal gain. "It's exhausting," Naomi admitted to Richard one evening as they sat on the villa's porch, the sound of the ocean filling the silence between them. "For every person who supports us, there's someone else trying to tear us down." Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not doing this for them," he said. "You're doing this for Ava, for every family that's been treated like we were. Focus on that." Naomi nodded, drawing strength from his words. The criticism hurt, but it couldn't overshadow the overwhelming support they had received. This fight was about more than just their family. It was about standing up for what was right. The airline's reckoning. By the time their vacation ended, the airline had issued multiple statements, each more apologetic than the last. They announced that Karen Millister, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy, had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. They also pledged to implement new training programs for their staff and invited Naomi and Richard to participate in discussions about policy changes. "It's a start," Daniel said during another video call as Naomi and Richard packed for their trip home. "But words are easy. We need to make sure they follow through with real actions." As the Walkers prepared to board their flight back home, Naomi felt a mixture of apprehension and hope. The incident that had started as a personal nightmare had grown into a national conversation, and their story was now a catalyst for change. A new chapter. When they arrived home, the Walkers were met with a whirlwind of media attention. Their story continued to dominate headlines, and Naomi found herself thrust into a role she hadn't anticipated, that of an advocate. With Daniel's guidance, she began working with other families who had faced similar injustices, sharing her platform to amplify their voices. She and Richard attended meetings with the airline's executives, where they pushed for meaningful reforms. Ava, too young to fully understand the magnitude of what had happened, remained a grounding presence for Naomi. Her daughter's laughter and innocence reminded her why this fight mattered, not just for their family, but for every child who deserved to grow up in a world where fairness and equality were more than just words. A legacy of change. Months later, as Naomi sat at her dining room table, reviewing a press release from the airline announcing their new accountability measures, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been exhausting, and the scars of their experience would never fully fade. But they had turned their pain into progress, transforming a moment of injustice into a movement for change. "Mommy," Ava called from the living room, holding up a drawing of dolphins swimming in a sparkling ocean. "Do you think the dolphins miss us?" Naomi smiled, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Maybe, sweetie," she said, "but don't worry. We'll see them again." And as she held Ava close, Naomi knew that they had done more than just stand up for themselves. They had paved the way for others to do the same. Their story was no longer just about what had happened to them. It was about what they had achieved, together, in the face of adversity. Turning pain into power. Months had passed since the Walkers' fateful flight, but the ripple effects of their story continued to shape their lives in ways Naomi never imagined. What began as an act of humiliation had transformed into a platform for advocacy, and Naomi found herself navigating a new reality as both a mother and an emerging public figure. The airline, under mounting public pressure, had implemented several reforms in response to the backlash. Policies were rewritten, training programs revamped, and an independent oversight committee was established to handle passenger complaints. It was progress, but Naomi and Richard knew there was still more to be done. Their journey was far from over. A seat at the table. One crisp fall afternoon, Naomi sat in a sleek conference room on the 34th floor of a towering downtown skyscraper. The windows overlooked a sprawling cityscape, but her focus was on the table before her. Around it sat executives from the airline, including their CEO, legal representatives, and members of the newly formed Oversight Committee. Daniel Graves was beside her, his calm and authoritative presence a source of comfort. "We're here to discuss actionable steps," the CEO began, his tone measured but earnest. "We want to hear your perspective on how we can improve and rebuild trust." Naomi cleared her throat, her nerves simmering just below the surface. But as she glanced at Daniel and thought of Richard and Ava, she steadied herself. This wasn't about personal vengeance. It was about creating lasting change. "First, I want to acknowledge the steps you've taken so far," Naomi began, her voice calm but resolute. "The training programs, the oversight committee, those are important, but they're not enough." The room fell silent as she continued. "It's not just about fixing policies. It's about changing the culture within your organization. That means ensuring that every employee understands the weight of their authority and the responsibility that comes with it. Bias training isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous process, and accountability has to start at the top. The CEO nodded, scribbling notes as she spoke. "We agree," he said. "We're committed to making these changes. But what does accountability look like to you?" Naomi glanced at Daniel, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "It looks like transparency," she said. "Publicly sharing your progress on these initiatives. Giving passengers a clear avenue to report issues and holding employees accountable when they fail to meet those standards. And it means involving people from diverse backgrounds in your decision-making processes." By the time the meeting ended, Naomi felt a sense of cautious optimism. The airline had promised to include her in ongoing discussions, and they'd committed to measurable goals for their reforms. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. A movement grows. Outside the corporate world, Naomi's story continued to resonate with everyday people. She was invited to speak at conferences and community events, sharing her experience and advocating for equity in the travel industry. Each time, she was met with applause and standing ovations, but it wasn't the recognition she valued. It was the conversations that followed. At one event, a young woman approached her after her speech, tears streaming down her face. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said. "I had a similar experience last year, but I didn't have the courage to speak up. Seeing what you've done, it gives me hope." Naomi hugged her, feeling the weight of those words. Hope. That was what this was all about. Richard, ever the steady presence, supported her every step of the way. He managed their household while Naomi traveled, ensuring that Ava's life remained as normal as possible. But even Ava seemed to sense the importance of what her parents were doing. "Mommy, are you helping other people now?" Ava asked one evening as Naomi tucked her into bed. Naomi smiled, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "I hope so, sweetheart," she said. "I'm trying." Ava beamed. "You're like a superhero," she declared, clutching Ellie the elephant to her chest. "You make things better." Naomi laughed softly, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Maybe not a superhero," she said, "but I'll do my best." The test of resilience. Not everyone welcomed Naomi's advocacy. Online trolls emerged, flooding her social media accounts with hateful comments and baseless accusations. Some claimed she was exaggerating the incident for attention or financial gain. Others spewed outright racism, their words a stark reminder of the prejudice that had sparked this journey in the first place. Naomi leaned on Richard and Daniel during these moments, their unwavering support helping her weather the storm. "Ignore the noise," Daniel advised during one particularly difficult week. "Focus on the people who believe in what you're doing. They're the ones who matter." Richard took a more direct approach. "You've already proven them wrong by standing up," he said. "Don't let their bitterness dim your light." Naomi channeled her frustration into her work, collaborating with advocacy groups to push for broader changes in the travel industry. She spoke out against systemic bias and the ways it manifested in everyday interactions, using her platform to amplify voices that had long been silenced. Ava's wide-eyed wonder. Amid the chaos of their new reality, the walkers made good on their promise to Ava. A month after the incident, they returned to the tropical paradise they had almost missed. This time, the experience was unmarred by conflict, and Ava finally got to see her beloved dolphins. Naomi watched as her daughter stood at the edge of the boat, her face lit with awe as the sleek creatures leaped through the waves. "Mommy, they're so pretty," Ava exclaimed, her laughter ringing out over the water. Naomi wrapped an arm around Richard, her heart swelling with gratitude. For all the challenges they had faced, moments like this made it worth it. Ava's joy reminded her why they fought: to create a world where every child could experience such wonder without fear of injustice. Legacy of change. A year after the incident, the airline hosted a press conference to unveil its new passenger policies and employee training programs. Naomi was invited to speak, a testament to the role she had played in shaping those changes. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the crowd. Executives, employees, journalists, and everyday travelers, and took a deep breath. This journey started with pain and humiliation, she began, but it's ending with progress and hope. This isn't just about my family. It's about creating a future where no one has to face what we did. Her words were met with thunderous applause, but Naomi knew the work was far from over. Change was a continuous process, one that required vigilance and perseverance. Still, she felt a sense of fulfillment knowing that she had turned her family's darkest moment into a beacon of light for others. As she stepped down from the podium, Richard and Ava met her at the edge of the stage. Ava beamed up at her, holding Ellie in one hand and a tiny plastic dolphin in the other. "Mommy," she said, her eyes shining. "You did it." Naomi knelt to hug her daughter tightly. "We did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "We all did." And as she stood with her family, the applause still echoing in her ears, Naomi felt a quiet sense of pride. They had faced the storm, and they had come out stronger. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, justice, and the power of unity.